Hello, everyone, and thank you for being with us today. My name is Brandy Pretlow, and I'm the VP of Programs and Services at the Steve Fund. We're so glad to be with you today. Welcome to our community conversation, supporting student belonging and mental health at a time of change. This is the third in a series of community conversations focused on the Supreme Court's affirmative action ruling and what it means for the mental health, emotional well-being, and belonging of students of color and campus communities. To view our first and second session in the series, you can use the links in the chat. Thank you, Deb. We would like to thank the American Council on Education for partnering with us on this community conversation. We also appreciate the generous support of Morgan Stanley for this program. Before we get started with this incredible conversation we have planned for you, I'd like to share a bit more about the Steve Fund. The Steve Fund's mission is to promote the mental health and emotional well-being of young people of color as they transition from adolescence into higher education, throughout their higher education experience, and as they transition into the workforce, so they can attain personal, academic, and career success and achieve their full potential. As we are engaging in the conversation, please feel free to enter your questions or comments into the chat. I also want to note at the end of this conversation, we will have time for an evaluation. So we appreciate ahead of time for your input and feedback as we continue to plan for future conversation and events that are relevant to this community. With that, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's conversation, Dr. Carlota Ocampo, the Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs and Associate Professor of Psychology at Trinity Washington University and a Steve Fund board member. Passing it over to Dr. Ocampo.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And as always, it's wonderful to be back here to discuss a topic of utmost importance, which is making sure that our young students of color and all students of color feel a sense of belongingness and understand that it is their place to be on the college campus and to be part of academia and to bring their skills and knowledge and talents to the mutual endeavor of education. Since we began this series, in earlier iterations of this series, I'd been reflecting on how are my students feeling about the affirmative action decision that came down in June. And I really wasn't picking up a sense from the students that they were thinking about it. They were more just concerned about the post-COVID landscape and easing some of the tensions that had come with and during that period of human history. But with the start of these couple of weeks of school, I've sensed a shift around this question, and I'm going to mention it. I'm going to kind of describe it like this, that our students are beginning to cognize what is intended to be, the striking down of quote race-based admissions, which is intended to be race-neutral admissions. But they're sort of internalizing that as I should not mention my race, or I should not bring my race to school with me. In other words, they're psychologically experiencing that as a negative. And as we know that race and ethnicity are such essential parts of a person's identity and experience, we want to create environments where when these students are here on our campuses, they understand that they can bring their full authentic selves. So in our session, we're going to talk today about some proactive strategies that promote a genuine sense of belonging and prioritize the mental health of students of color in this post-affirmative action landscape. We want to also explore how student organizations, sororities, fraternities, peer support, and other organizations and communities of faith can serve as protective factors, preventing isolation, promoting belongingness, enhancing positive student experiences, and fostering shared identity. We'll talk about why it's important for colleges and universities to be deliberate about communicating to students that they're welcome and they belong. We're going to describe some examples of campus-based organizations that can promote a sense of belonging and serve as protective factors for mental health and emotional well-being. And we're going to list some essential elements that go into creating effective campus-based organizations, communities, and affinity groups that nurture belonging and inclusion, with the added benefit of strengthening academic performance and helping to optimize retention, which is one of those key assessment factors that all institutions are trying to meet. Joining me are are two wonderful panelists with a variety of experience in this particular endeavor. And I'm going to introduce our panelists for today's conversation and ask each of them to unmute and share a little bit about their background and their calling to this work of supporting students of color. And we'll start with Dr. Michael Mason.
Good afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you are on this planet. Thank you for that invitation. Thank you for allowing me to have this moment. So my name is Michael Gerard Mason. I'm an associate dean in the Office of African-American Affairs, a therapist by training, the director of Project Rise, a peer counseling project for Black students in particular, and a lover of student development. One of the things that I think I would say defines the work that I do is I've always thought about what would it mean to become an expert in the emotional experience of learning and how complicated it is to learn. And I soon discovered that there is much work to be done in supporting students as they struggle to be successful and to fail and bounce back and be resilient and all of these sorts of things. And I have watched the idea that we can normalize difficulty and acknowledge that some students, maybe more than others, experience difficulties at a higher frequency than others, and that be okay. And that has changed trajectories for students. And it's so profound that I think I've committed, my professional life to sort of liberating these students of the burden, of being different in that way, and encouraging them to continue to be their best selves. And it's powerful work. That's me.
That's great. Thank you. I'm sure that this is going to be a great conversation. And also joining us is Dr. Jeannie Manese, who will, I invite you to introduce yourself as well.
Aloha. I'm going to say that because I now am semi-retired and I live on the island of Kauai. And I'm Dr. Jeannie Manese, and I received my doctoral degree from the University of Maryland, College Park in counseling psychology. As I said, I'm now semi-retired and I live in Kauai. I'm a consultant and I serve as a national advisor with the Steve Fund. As my career, I would identify myself as a psychologist, but in particular, a practitioner, scholar, advocate. And my career has spanned over 4 decades at 5 universities and semester at sea. My last full-time position was at the University of California, Irvine, or otherwise known as UCI. And there I was the director for over a decade. Throughout my career, my passions have been providing multicultural clinical supervision to all those budding psychologists that have worked with me, implementing strength-based and peer programs. So, Michael, I appreciate what you do and have a stake in that. And also mentoring students of color through the higher education pipeline and into early career leadership roles has also been another calling of mine. I am a fellow of the APA, American Psychological Association, and I'm also a fellow of the Asian American Psychological Association. And I want to add that I've also been honored to receive the Lifetime Achievement Award from the APA Minority Fellowship Program. This program is near and dear to my heart, and I continue my role with them as a mentor for their Psychology Summer Institute. So that's me, and that's what I'm doing these days.
That's great. Thank you. So a little bit about myself as well. I'm the provost at Trinity Washington University in Washington, D.C. We're a PBI and an HSI. And we've made a very sort of conscious choice to support students of color to make sure that they can, reach the fullest potential that they can reach through their college education and go out into the community and really impact the communities that we draw from. So we're very much a from the community for the community institution. My background is in neuropsychology. I've been very interested and done work in racist incident-based trauma. And part of what I try to architect at Trinity is programs like our Trinity Dare program, which you can look at on Trinity's website, but it's basically a 5 action step platform to support students of color in a variety of different ways. It's not what we're going to be talking about today, but I did want to give you a little bit of background about myself. So back to setting the stage for today's conversation. You know, the current landscape can send a discouraging message to students of color with the overturn of affirmative action. And we've talked about that landscape in previous iterations of this seminar series. We want to make sure that students understand that when they get to our campuses, they belong, and we want to make sure that they experience full inclusion. The Steve Fund did convene a crisis response task force during the COVID to talk about sort of the multi-layered challenges and crises that are impacting students today. So, you know, they've undergone the COVID pandemic, they've undergone a great deal of social unrest and very widely publicized, you know, violence in social media around issues of race. And they've also undergone an economic downturn. So our students are dealing with a lot. And now sort of on top of that, here comes the affirmative action decision to cap off the moment. And now we're rolling into September 23, wanting to make sure that we're able to really make sure that these students understand that their campuses are places where they are safe and where they can bring their full selves and their authentic selves, and that they won't be marginalized on their campuses. So, Dr. Mason, I know you talked about and you've spent, you know, most of your career making sure that students feel that on their campuses. And during the last convening of the Steve Fund, the expert advisor convening, you mentioned that colleges and universities need to be very intentional about supporting students through their campus organizations and communities, especially during this period where, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion are under fire. Would you elaborate on this guidance about intentionality and what that means?
Absolutely, and I definitely hope Dr. Manis can join me in this conversation. It's super important. I think to do this, I would love to introduce some language, not super technical, it's simple ideas about attachment. And, you know, when we think about babies and we think about their capacity to explore and take risk, we have these concepts called, you know, secure attachments or secure bases, right? And the more secure these bases are, the more likely students are, the children are to move away from, experiment, and then come back as they need to. Secure bases. I use that as the foundation of these concepts of bridging and bonding in learning. And in practice, you know, students are going to, in their communities of origin, in places where they're similar, they have the same culture, the same ethnic identity, the same work ethic, morals, ethics, and values, the similarity, they're able to make sense of things they experience. When they come to college, many students are encouraged to bridge, try something different, go out and see new things. And I love this idea because it becomes one of the most profound examples of difficulties that students of color often face, especially in predominantly white institutions or historically white institutions. It's often students of color are expected to bridge at the expense of bonding. The spaces where they are with one another, they can synthesize things that they learn as they go out. Those things become less and less as they get older. And some of that is because of that language around self-segregation or self-secluding practices, or these kind of languages we use to pathologize very normal ways of being. Those things get challenged. In this moment, I was panicked that if we weren't careful, we could even stigmatize more this need to be with similar. And I think one of the things that I've advocated for is for universities to be very intentional about normalizing this anticipated developmental need that students will need to have communities they feel safe in as they go out and make risk, as they go out and meet students who don't look like them, as students who didn't have the same backgrounds, students who are studying different things. They go out, they get bumped, they get bruised, they get celebrated, and then they come back to that secure base and metabolize it. And it is that metabolizing that is where learning occurs. And one of the things that I think I've advocated for then and continue to do is that the best universities are making sure that students have both. Because the reality is students of color may not, but students who are in the quote unquote majority do. They have that opportunity to go out and bridge and be with quote unquote diversity, and then they go back to their communities of origin. We have to make sure that all students have the benefit of that process, bridging and bonding. And I think it's the most necessary time to be doing that. Because in some ways, some students, as you mentioned earlier, Dr. Campo, is that students begin to have some anxiety about identifying with their affinity descriptor, whether that's, ethnicity, race, gender, disability qualifier. They begin to get anxious about that because of things like the affirmative action change. And we have to be proactive to let them know that they can be their whole selves. And they have to be if they're going to learn, and the community is going to benefit from that learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. So what I hear you saying is, or as you were talking, I was reflecting on, I was thinking about sort of groundbreaking, essays like, why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? As if that's somehow not a good thing, right? I mean, we sort of had talked about that socially in the historical spectrum as, why aren't we having more of a melting pot, kind of phenomenon? But what I hear you saying is that no, in fact, we should be encouraging or making safe spaces for folks to feel comfortable in their affinity groups, whatever that may be. And we may talk a little later on about some specific affinity groups that have been useful on our campuses, but that it's really okay when we see kids maybe even segregating themselves naturally in some ways, understanding that that is a kind of a cocoon from which they can launch into coming together. Would that be a way of phrasing what you're getting at here?
I think that's spot on. I guess the thing I would even push a bit is just to say, I don't even know if I would describe it as segregating, because that sort of carries a weight with it.
It does.
And I'm thinking the students are doing what is quite normal. We only think about segregating when they're people of color. Everybody else is just doing what the world does. Go home, go to work, go to school, come home. The moment we go to whatever is home, something is amiss in higher ed. And I think we have to challenge that notion. But spot on.
Yeah, interesting. Well, Dr. Menese, what do you have to say about this? What is your take on how colleges and universities should be very deliberate about exploring some of these challenges and some of their support for campus organizations and student-led organizations as well?
Well, in addition to what Dr. Mason and you have pointed out, I think it's very, very important to recognize and acknowledge what the landscape has been for students. And I'm a clinician by training, and so we are not surprised that the anxiety levels of students, of all students, but has gone up, has skyrocketed. If you think about these students in their school years, they have seen more gun violence, they have dealt with COVID, and they have been, isolated from their peers in a way that has never happened, at least in my lifetime, not in traditional public and private schools in this country. And so I think it's very important to be deliberate in having programs that bring students together so they can build communities, so they can also be empowered. That empowerment, if you have a sense of your agency, this is the antidote for anxiety, right? If you have a sense of agency and a sense of hope, then you can go out there, like Dr. Mason said, and bridge and bond and feel comfortable and safe. But campuses need to recognize that the students, and as resilient as they are, they have still had to deal with these things. And these things, like I said, the gun violence, COVID, etc., these are phenomena that are traumatic. And as resilient as you are, you have to feel something different in order to feel safe. And that's where campuses can play huge roles in providing these environments for students and centering all students, particularly those that have been marginalized, centering programs so that these programs include everyone. So with that, I know we have lots to talk about, but that would be my take on it.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah. And, just before we switch over and talking about some examples, I want to again follow up with, because this conversation is really kind of making my neuron synapse a little bit. And that is, what you both are saying, and Dr. Mason, you said as well, is that I guess, on campuses, we often try to create these affinity groups to create smaller institutions within institutions. Like we may have a dorm floor that's set aside for students in the nursing program or something. So we're trying to kind of create this superordinate thing for students to feel that they belong in. But here students come to our institutions with their affinities, and somehow those affinities can somehow make us feel nervous, I guess, under the framework in which we live. And however, we can allow that Black Student Alliance to really pursue its passions and decide what it wants to focus on with respect to the struggle that it might be experiencing either on a campus or in society, and support that, rather than feel that we have to somehow direct those student energies in a different direction so that they can assimilate better or something like that. That's part of what's coming out for me from this discourse. Am I taking this the wrong way, or is that part of what you're encouraging campuses to think about?
Well, I would say, that it's really important for students to feel safe, and that takes on a lot of different aspects. But along those lines, I also want to say that with the empowerment, student orgs also need resources, that students can show up, but unless the university provides facilities, events, funding, it is very, very difficult if you are coming to campus to have the kinds of programs and services that you need for integration into the campus. And I want to use this word integration into the campus because as a researcher, I know, and I'm sure Dr. Mason can agree with me, that students who feel a sense of belonging at the campus have higher graduation rates. And the dropout rate is really very deeply impacted by students who aren't feeling a part of the campus. They don't want to show up, right? And if you don't show up and you don't feel welcome, then you don't stay. That's just human nature.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'll jump in and just say, absolutely, yes, I agree with you, and you are spot on. I think there are two things that seem present to me at the moment. One is I will give the universities a pass here and say, I do a lot of work, and for 10 years, I've been providing funds to, affinity-based groups, specifically Black student orgs. And these groups are doing powerful things for their student bodies and the people in their organizations. And many of them have budgets of less than $500 an academic year. They are putting on programs, they're hosting events, they are doing things. That's not to say that that's all they need, but what they need is the support. They need somebody to acknowledge that your interests are real, they are viable, and we'll create a framework for those to exist. And then the money is helpful, but it's not necessary. They can come, again, I have to be careful with these things because I don't want to say don't give them money. And they are able to do some powerful things if we can just acknowledge they have a right to coalesce, to come together, to do meaningful things. The second thing is we cannot understate how profound a disruption COVID has been. And
Yes.
I'm grateful for you to come back and, both of you have sort of come back and loop to this. We actually are only learning what the implications of COVID are developmentally, especially as we start to talk about groups, communal groups that do so much of our work in proximity to one another, right? Proximity matters to people of color, especially. So the fact that we have a whole cohort of students who've been learning and trying to do that absent proximity is complicated, or proximity leveraged through technology, which we have no idea how those things implicate mental health. And we're learning. So the thing that I will hopefully press right now is for any family, any student who's listening to this, talk to somebody. And that's not to say talk to a clinician, but just tell your story. Because the more of us who hear and the more of you all who tell your stories, the more we'll be able to refine and fine tune, the things that we know have worked for the last 50 years of doing, mass education for students of color. So those are two things.
So that's great. So I always reflect on what I've heard. And one of the things that's coming up for me is this idea that we don't, as these students enter our campuses, while we may want to have, quote, race neutral admissions, we don't necessarily want to have, quote, a race neutral campus experience, because we want students to be able to bring their fullness, their interests, what their backgrounds are. Those are, the diversity movement has recognized those factors as enrichment factors. They can be enrichment factors for everyone on the community, but they can also be ways for students themselves to feel like they can bring their authentic selves, and that what their goals are, what their aims are in getting this education, that they can feel free to pursue those rather than pursue someone else's idea of how they should turn out, for example. But I'm sure we could talk about this for a long time. I do want to shift to some actual examples. I know that both of you have been architects of some really great, very successful programs that have supported students of color, and we'd love to hear about those. So let's start with Dr. Mason. Could you talk about your RISE peer support initiative, as well as other peer support programs that you see having a role to play on college campuses? And what is the impact of these peer networks on students at UVA and beyond?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. I think the starting point, maybe this will also just be, I think it's helpful for us to have a framework on how we're approaching this really complicated thought. Simple, straightforward thought for me is that the shift in the ways that we think about affirmative action are clearly making us pivot towards an idea around diversity, and in some ways away from a conversation that's specifically about race, whether we're talking about race, discrimination within race, or racism obviously linked to race. We're pivoting to a broader conversation. The reason why I'm talking about that is because about 14 years ago, some students were having a profound challenge, and they were thinking that there were very few places in a university where they could go where they wouldn't be pathologized, where something wouldn't be wrong with them. And in some of that, what they were saying is when we go to administrators across the country and say we are experiencing bias, discrimination, and racism, there may be some skepticism about it. And one of the things that they were trying to think about is how do we deal with that? And how do we acknowledge that the things we experience are absolutely real. And in these real cases, how can we be helpful in case a university isn't necessarily equipped to do that? Project Rise emerged as a peer counseling project for Black students, where they were being trained to sit across from one another and do that very important task of listening, acknowledging, and where appropriate, responding developmentally with some minor skills. And in the case that they were in over their heads, refer to people like me, clinicians at the university or administrators who can be helpful. And what we have seen is that the students were really interested in taking this model into more organic spaces where they were saying, we don't want to just be confined to the room. We're actually doing this everywhere. So I use these skills on the bus. I use these skills on the stoop at the party. I use these skills on the ride home to DC. I can listen and recognize that one of my peers is having social, emotional, and academic distress and do something about it. And one of the things that we quickly discovered is that that is in itself powerful, because about 60 to 65% of first response is from students in higher education, not people like I or Dr. Manese. It is the people who are living with them and around them who are intervening. So Project Rise has evolved into a training system that is preparing all students at our university to recognize, listen empathically, and recognize emotional and social distress, respond where it's developmentally appropriate to do so, and refer them to a good resource in the cases where they are in over their heads. And we have seen more students experience the university as being helpful than we might have ever imagined, because there are real barriers to learning. And if a student doesn't have a computer, if a student is feeling, like the professor is not listening, if a student feels like they've been slighted in enrollment, all of those things have implications on learning. And students can help us help them work it through. So Project Rise has emerged as a framework to understand that.
That's great. So if any, is there a resource that people who are interested in learning about Project Rise, is there a website or another resource that?
Absolutely. So you can always just Google the Office of African-American Affairs at the University of Virginia. Maybe I'll drop something in the chat before this is over. But just go to the Office of African-American Affairs at the University of Virginia, and there is a Project Rise tab where you can learn more about this project.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Dr. Manese, I know that so we've talked about current students undergoing, socio-emotional struggles and getting their sense of belonging on campus and how valuable peer support can be. But what about alumni? How can alumni support students who are in an institution? And particularly, how can alumni of color support students who are students of color who are going through that experience? I know that you started a program that asked those questions, and you came up with a great answer in the Beyond Ring Road workshops of the University of California, Irvine. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How did that program foster a shared sense of identity for students of color at that institution?
Thank you very much for bringing this up. It is certainly a program that I'm very proud of its sustainability. It was I guess designed over 5 or 6 years ago, and it continues to grow and develop. But what really happened here, and Beyond Ring Road, just to give people a context, is the University of California, Irvine is built in circles, and there's a park in the middle, and then around the major campus is Ring Road. And so we would talk about, oh, we're on campus, and we have a lot of residential life, and people hang out, and then you cross over, and then you're in the real world. You're in the city of Irvine. And so Beyond Ring Road is off campus. And Beyond Ring Road was born out of a recognition that for first-generation college students and other minoritized students, transition from college post-graduation can be daunting. I also say this from my own lived experience. And so obstacles that face these students can include loss of financial aid. It can include losing your health insurance. It can be losing your housing. It can be a rejection from graduate programs. You've been a student for your whole life, and now all these things are happening. And what are you to do? And so with a focus group and the support of the Steve Fund, I got more information from these students and really came to understand that they need something beyond Ring Road. And it happened in a couple of factors, key elements. I think key element was collaboration. So it became a collaboration between the counseling center, who saw this rush of students, and myself, who is very active on the campus and had peer programs and other programs. And so students were letting me know in many ways, behind closed doors and in front of closed, in open doors, that they needed something else to make this transition. And so this collaboration was between the counseling center, alumni services, and the career center. And that had very important aspects. One is the alumni services on most campuses is the place where student can belong in a very active way post-graduation. But until this program, I would say that many students of color didn't really understand or feel connected or even drawn to alumni services, because it's like, oh no, I don't have any money, I can't be a donor, I can't afford the membership. And out of this project, alumni services at UCI really became, in my view, very aware and social justice oriented, and just plain smart, because they wanted more alumni engagement. They wanted more participation. And so if they could reach out to the students. So we started a series of workshops, and the first workshop involved identities. So many people had this long-standing identity as a student, but what were you gonna be? You could still be an anteater, but now you're gonna be an alumni. And more importantly, you're going to be probably and hopefully an employee, and maybe a professional title like a doctor or a dentist or a psychologist or an engineer or something. But these titles were roles and titles that we weren't accustomed to. And how do you make those roles and titles fit? And so part of this series was getting the Career Center involved as well, to help these students navigate their professional job search, their salary negotiations, their relocations, their communities, and build an ongoing community, not only as a student, but as an adult going into the workforce. And so, these days, when I last left the UCI campus, alumni services welcome students with sweatshirts first year. And in the last year, which this program is targeted for, not only did they have workshops that included things like exploring your identities, tools to navigate not only budgets, but things like student loans, checking accounts, 401ks, 403bs, on, and to also help students recognize that it's not always an easy and straight path. So we brought back, and I'm happy to say this, Dr. Mason, we brought back alumni who were early career alumni of color. Many of them, were very successful. They graduated, yet they had, a transition that included these obstacles of things, as I mentioned. And so they had role models, and they also could begin building communities, because the alumni services has affinity groups. Whether you want to identify as an engineer, there's an engineer affinity group. Maybe you're still connected to, your hometown. I grew up, my parents are from here, but I grew up in San Diego. So maybe I wanted to relate to the affinity group, the alumni from San Diego, or maybe it was your racial or cultural identity. So the Latinx, affinity group of alumni, all these places were absolute pathways for building community. And the other thing that I thought was so important was the benefits that you could get as an alumni, not only the social benefits, but all the perks that come with car insurance and hotels and this and that, you know, if you were part of this larger group. And so, again, I just want to say thank you for letting me talk about this program. I hope that there's more collaborations like this, because student affairs sometimes has a different budget line, and that budget line often gets cut. And alumni services has a different budget line, and that budget line is often someplace where they can pull in resources for these kinds of programs. And so with that, I just want to say thank you and hope that other people can, you know, collaborate across units and across budget lines so that our students can get served.
Mm-hmm. And that is a key recommendation of the Steve Fund Task Force, to collaborate across different units. Dr. Mason.
Yeah, Dr. Benesi, I just want to say thank you. I love the idea of transitions. So Project Rise, one of the core principles that emerged out of our early research about Project Rise was this idea that, and I think we're starting to write about this more over the last 15 years or so, but this second year slump, this thing that happens from transition from first to second year, something happens. And what we noticed is that we had a spike in depression and anxiety as students were transitioning from first to second. And we couldn't understand that until we started to do more and more of these studies. And we discovered that a part of it was this simple thing, that all of our programs were geared to help students transition into college, but not through. So
Right.
all of a sudden, all of the programs would end and we would take care of the new students who were coming in, and these second years were finding themselves in a panic. The
Mm-hmm.
part that's connected to this, though, is we also discovered an interesting finding for students who identified as Black. And it was that there was a delayed panic when they transitioned out of the college into the workspace. It was only about a year later that they started to have the stuff about, I don't feel prepared. I don't know if I did enough. I don't know that my social network is big enough to be managed. All of the depressions and anxiety linked to job didn't show up until about a year later. And we understood that's for many students of color, including Black students, that I think a part of the emphasis is on the milestone of graduation. They don't think about beyond. So
Mm-hmm.
the fact that your program is starting to connect the students from the moment they get in, now with sweaters, to university, alumni who are out there in the world, that's a beautiful thing. And I think that's definitely a great example of how universities can be intentional about putting, these do need resources, putting resources aside to make a continuation so that these students can imagine themselves from day one into the future. And I think that has profound emotional benefit, that they can see themselves well beyond the university life. And I think that is amazing.
Mm-hmm. I think this is such a key concept that we're getting at here. As you know, the Steve Fund started out really focusing on students of color in higher education, and has now expanded that vision to supporting students as they go out into the workforce. Because I think that, for many students, even if their college experience might have some rockiness to it, they nevertheless find a home there, as you mentioned before, Dr. Mason. But then when they go out, into the world, we know that they face a whole nother, very different set of challenges, particularly when they're trying to pursue avenues where they may be underrepresented, where people from their backgrounds may be underrepresented. And so having networks that can follow them and support them through the transition, I think is really key. One of the things that I'm reflecting on, I mentioned earlier that Trinity has a platform called DARE, that stands for Driving Actions for Racial Equity, which you can also look at on Trinity's website, which has a variety of different action points. But one of the points is very consciously developing internship networks for students of color into industries where they may be underrepresented, and providing different kinds of supports for them along the way as they transition from, hopefully, they've joined an affinity group at Trinity and they've had a great experience and they feel seen and they feel like they belong and they understand that, yeah, I have something to contribute. And then we want to kind of walk with them during that transition from Trinity, where they're so appreciated and nurtured, to a place where now they're going to have to sort of stand on their own, maybe without some of those emotional supports. Hopefully they've internalized them at that point. But the thing that really strikes me really about both the programs that you're talking about, both the peer mentoring, which I assume is somewhat, perhaps has an element of students from senior and junior classes mentoring, students who are sophomores and first year students, as well as alumni mentoring, students who are graduating and entering the workforce. This would have the added benefit of keeping students retained in school and connected to the institution. And as you mentioned, these are challenges that we really struggle with. I mean, every institution wants a better alumni network. And what better way to do it than for students of color than to create a whole network of students of color that want to support each other? I mean, I can tell you right now, I would be attracted to that. I would be very attracted. I am attracted. I mean, I do mentor, to be completely honest, and I am attracted to the idea of mentoring students with backgrounds similar to mine, not just ethnically, but on a variety of, different criteria, because I really feel like, hey, I can show you how to walk this walk. And that, I think that is a very powerful way for institutions not only to help students, but as I said before, to meet some of their own metrics of retention and alumni, continuing, alumni connection and support. So I can really see that some of these programs can have more than one positive outcome. And it almost seems like really honoring diversity is a win-win for everybody, doesn't it? Anyway, we're about at the time when this conversation is intended to shift over to questions and answers from the listening audience and viewing audience, but it doesn't seem like we have any questions. So I want to take this moment to actively invite those of you in the audience, if you have any questions or just things that you want to enter into the conversation, to please drop those in the chat. And while we're waiting for that, I want to draw on another essential element of what you've been talking about, which is the idea of mentorship as a pedagogy. Mentorship as a pedagogy is a part of inclusive excellence curricula. And I know, Dr. Menese, you had a book, Casebook in Multicultural Supervision, Lenses, Models, and Applications, where you really highlight the conceptual frameworks for addressing cultural competency and mentoring for those in supervisory roles in mental health, and supervising other kinds of paraprofessional mental health experiences. But also, how does mentoring generally play this role in preventing isolation and promoting belonging, creating positive student experiences, not just for the mentee, but for the mentor as well? So why don't we shift for a little bit to talk about the power of mentoring with respect to students of color really participating in higher education and having a great experience. And
Thank you.
whoever wants to jump in, yeah, go ahead, Dr. Menese.
Thank you. In that book in particular, I highlight the multicultural mentoring model. We call it the M3, and it was developed by Dr. Joe White, who is the father of Black psychology. And if you're a psychologist and you're a person of color, you recognize this model in that the model attends front and center to the multiple identities of the mentee and the mentor, so that we can feel that affirmation and appreciation. We can also build our relationship in a cultural context that recognizes what our identities, is meaning and how that impacts us. And it also, for many first generation and students of color, it is not a straightforward thing to go out and get a career. I can say when I told my father I was going to be a psychologist, he said to me, people should not share their problems with outside the family. Now,
Are
my
we
mother,
related?
now, you know,
Are
and
we
I'm
related?
sure I wasn't the first, right? My mother said, "Oh, just be quiet and go find someone at your university who will help you, but just tell him you're going to school and you're gonna be successful." You know, so she helped me bridge that. But anyway, so you know, there's things that have to be worked out, and this model is also very relationship centered, where the mentee is empowered, you know, to be their full self. The mentor is compassionately accepting. You know, there's not that parental expectation, but rather more of acceptance. You want to be a psychologist? Dr. White was so happy I wanted to be a psychologist. And there's also a recognition of the power differential. So these elements, and especially the element that Dr. Mason can probably attribute to mentoring, is in mentoring, we often understand you don't have just one mentor. You know, you have multiple mentors, you have multiple networks, and you have multiple mentoring experiences. So maybe as a woman of color, I would need a certain mentor. And as a psychologist, I would need a certain mentor. And the other thing about mentoring, not only in the academic arena, but the studies show that those who have mentoring in their careers have higher satisfaction in their workplace than those who do not have mentoring. And also those that have mentors are often have more accessibility to leadership and other resources that wouldn't occur if they didn't have that mentoring. And so this is also a built-in factor that is part of the alumni services, that they do have a network, and they're always a call out for, you know, anteaters to mentor other anteaters. So Dr. Mason, I know you probably have lots to add. I'll turn it over to you.
You know, I'm tickled. I didn't realize this is the mascot. Yes, anteaters. Is that where this?
I was thinking the same thing.
But
That's the California mascot.
it tickles me every time I hear you say it. But right on the anteater.
I love
You know,
that.
I think the one part of this that I think is also profound, and again, for anybody watching this, for your children and families, the idea of mentoring, whether it's faculty to students, supervisor to supervisee, what it is actually communicating is that there is a role for transmission of knowledge that I think is broken. And some of that is linked to technology. A lot of it now is linked to COVID. But this thought that we can pass down information from person to person, generation to generation is broken. You know, I used to talk with a lot of young people, and I would say, you know, learning from experience is overrated, right? Or I should refine that to say learning from your own experience is overrated. Because a lot of students now think that they have to just barrel ahead by themselves, do it on their own, and they'll learn from their mistakes. When the vast majority of the world are actually trying to avoid, you know, to take in the guidance you can, make the mistakes you have to, but that can't just be the only framework for learning. And I love this idea of committing to a model of mentoring that encourages people to make good use of that transmission, that pathway, because it's definitely one that I think is becoming weaker. And I think that's probably a theme that we've been talking about today, is that there is a role to play that is communal, that college inherently isn't a lonely thing. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be an isolating thing. That there are layers and layers and layers of relationships that enrich the higher education experience that I think we've forgotten or that we don't leverage as much. And I think that's what Dr. Manise and I are sort of putting out here as a framework is we are going to be brighter, stronger, happier, more successful the more layered our social networks are and the more complex the functions of those networks. So I love this idea of saying that we still have a lot to give as mentors, as supervisors, as faculty to students and students to students, there are things that we can do that will enrich or improve the experience of others. And don't be afraid to share that, regardless of the nature of that pathway. Do it. Share
Mhm.
something with others. So I love it.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, find that community, find your community.
Mhm. Well, I love this this idea of really kind of externalizing the mentor relationship. I think at least I remember my experience in college, mentoring wasn't formalized, and maybe it shouldn't be, formalized, but I think that having it be a more overt part of the student experience has big payoffs. And I will say that at Trinity, as part of DARE, under Platform 3, Inclusive Excellence, our science department got a big grant. It was a couple $1 million, I think, to really work on integrating. Well, there were a variety of things, but part of it was to really work on integrating mentoring into the curriculum in a very overt way, because many women of color don't necessarily see themselves in the sciences, largely because I think the way that society creates what the scientific atmosphere looks like and then is delivered through the various media that we may access has historically excluded, right? Lack of representation has historically excluded, people of color, even though we know that, I mean, we've got, people of color have a bunch of like Nobel Prizes in sciences, but somehow that piece is not always evident in the textbooks. And so part of the idea was to diversify the faculty, but then also diversify the way that the faculty taught, including building in a 1-credit class called Mentor Moments, where students could come in and really talk about what is it like to be a scientist, and having sometimes guest speakers come from labs, people who are doing the quotidian work of science, who are people of color, and particularly women of color, for the undergraduate population at Trinity as a women's college, as I said before, a PBI and an HSI, but having sort of visual models to help the students know that, what you can bring here is just as important as what anyone else could bring. And in fact, you might be the smartest person in the room. So really transforming the way that we think about student affinity groups, not just as being something that happens through student affairs, right? But something that can happen through academic affairs as well and really be integrated as part of the curriculum. We still don't have any questions. We do have about 5 more minutes left for this part of our discussion. So what I'd like is perhaps, well, really anything y'all want to talk about, but one thing that I think we might not have touched on yet is some different kinds of affinity groups, besides the RISE program or the Beyond Ring Road, the different kinds of affinity groups that we've seen work on our campuses to make students feel like a sense of self-actualization. Do you have any other examples that we can point our audience towards as they look at thinking about how can I really integrate some of these programs onto my campus?
I'll jump in, and before I think about orgs, maybe I'll just sort of reflect on the thought about the smartest person in the room. I think one of the interesting things about that phrase is that the smartest person in the room depends on the questions being asked. And I think from that vantage point, all of us at all times are the smartest person in the room about some things. And I take that approach to student development so that I can encourage them to say, you know more about a lot of things than I do. So the only way this works is if we can commit to share and engage together in this process. I think that's important. You out there in the audience is the smartest person in every room you're going into about some things.
Absolutely.
Not all things. The first thing I think I'll say though about the student organization business is that UVA, the University of Virginia, has a concept called student self-governance. And it's this idea, it's actually a legal idea now, that students can create independent organizations, independent of our university, and that are contractually separate legally from our university, and they can create these things infinitely. So right now, we will average anywhere between 650 and maybe 750 student organizations. Many of them, or all of the 100% of them, are created by students. Many of them have diversity descriptors as their characteristics, right? They're affinity-based groups. So we have right now about 33 of those have, the diaspora, African diaspora in their mission statement. So they are focusing on Black students. And then we have hundreds more that are looking at all of the other affinity sort of categories, right? I think that's important. So we have, and I'll stay with this because we talked about the Black Student Union, because I think classically when we think about Black organizations, we think about the BSAs, the BSUs of the universities, and that's important. One of the things that I think has enriched our university is that students were encouraged, and some of that through tensions, to increase the number of ways that they represent what Black means. So now we have, Ethiopian and Eritrean Student Alliance. We have the Students for Increasing the Caribbean Awareness. We have the Organization of African Students. We have all of these affinity-based groups within one diversity qualifier, which allows for there to be this diversity of experience even within group. And that to me is really important. And I think, more than just sort of saying, here are all of the examples of these organizations that are really powerful and helpful. Some of them are very old, like our Black Voices. The gospel choirs exist probably across all of the universities in some form or another. What I think I would encourage is that for students to go out and just start to experience some breath in those first years. Join some things. Don't take on leadership of things. If we had more time, I could talk about what students do with leadership, but just join some things and be nourished by communities, different communities, whether it's chess, checkers, a cappella groups, dance clubs, affinity-based cooking groups. Try different things so that you can begin to see which of those are going to have some, affinity towards you, some things that can, map onto you. And as you matriculate, depth, narrow, and go deeper. And that's when you start to develop your leadership capacity and you start to see, maybe this is one I want to be, taking some leadership role in. And I would encourage you to just sort of take a look at that, because all of these organizations really want to nurture you. And the question is, what parts of you do you want to be nurtured? And just experiment. Try lots of things. Don't lead lots of things. Try lots of things.
That's great. That's great advice. Dr. Manese, what is your experience with different student affinity groups that could be successful?
Well, I think in addition to what Dr. Mason has pointed out, a lot of the affinity groups, or a lot of the affiliation groups that I've seen, are students who may all be resident advisors or may all be working in the education opportunities program, or they may be TAs for a certain professor. And so I think those are also avenues that students can find their community. So, in addition to the organizations, I think just different ways to find community. And for those, I think, that come from, more spiritual or religious background, that is another important, touchstone, another important community where they can share those similarities and values.
That's great. Yes, and we didn't get to talk about spiritual or religious affinity groups. I know at Trinity we have organizations like the Muslim Student Organization, where we've provided spaces for Muslims to be able to observe traditions. Ramadan, we have asked it's as simple as asking professors in evening classes to let their students break when the sun goes down to go and have a meal if they've been fasting during Ramadan, that kind of thing. I think there's a lot of ways that we can learn about different student traditions and support them. I also want to say, as we kind of wrap up this part of the conversation and shift into closing, that I really love to support, to kind of follow students where they are interested in a given year. Oh, we just got a question. Okay, well, we just got a question. So how is it possible for a student of color to feel like they belong if they're attending a PWI and is one of the very few students of color in their school? Hence, no critical mass and no affinity group that revolve around their identity, and perhaps no familiar groups in the community surrounding the campus. That's a great question. Maybe, well, let me kind of finish up what I was saying, because I think this might somewhat answer that question, and that is letting students have a voice to come forward with an issue that they might be concerned about, and supporting the students and kind of following where they lead. So for example, we had a student at Trinity who had been impacted by gun violence and wanted to start a group around that topic. And we let her lead that initiative with guidance, of course. But I think that might be a way that a student of color, could bring an issue to a campus that other students might be interested in, and give that person a leadership role around the impact of that particular issue. Another example could be, we have climate change groups now, of course. Everybody is very interested in that, the young people, as well as we have the Butterfly Network, which is for undocumented students. So I think that regardless of ethnicity or their, racial identification, students can be empowered to lead on an issue that they're interested in, that other students may want to follow. And we just have a couple more minutes, but Dr. Mason and then Dr. Menese, what would you say about a student who feels like they're the only one on a campus, and how can they feel a sense of belongingness? Oh, Dr. Mason, you're on mute. Yep. Love that mute button.
Yes, I try to be responsible. So I think I love the question. It's an important question. And I think it speaks to the transactional nature of belonging. And at our university, I think a big component of it, for me, is that the university has an obligation to do some behavioral things to communicate welcome, right? I think I experience belonging when I am welcomed into the space, whether that's through inviting intellectual discourse, whether it's inviting breaking bread, whether it's inviting doing something that invites the other person and communicates that they have a role to play. We haven't even started to talk about community building and all of those things. I try to keep it super simple. You can communicate welcome, and that welcome is more likely to engender belonging than not. So you don't have to wait till you have critical mass. Universities, you don't have to wait until you have 17,000, X number of students or X type of students. You can begin to communicate a love, a compassion, a welcome for every individual student as they are individuals, and that will increase belonging. And I think that is what this question is speaking to. What do I do in the absence of people like me who are being welcomed to the space? And in that way, I might say, hold your university accountable to welcoming you there, because you definitely belong there. It's a matter of whether or not you get the transaction to be welcomed to the space.
Yeah, I love that. I completely endorse that. Everything you said. And Dr. Menese, last word in maybe 1 minute, 1.5 minutes as we wrap up. What do you think about really making sure that all students feel like they belong, even if they can't see themselves in the space in the way that?
Yes, even if they can't see themselves in the space, are they seen? Are they seen? Are they affirmed? Are they known? Okay, because that is a welcome. When I am seen for who I am, when I am welcome for what my culture, my identities, my family, the things that matter, when you understand and are interested in what I bring to the campus as a student, then that student is part of the campus because they are known. And so I ask that universities, even if there's just one, that every interaction helps that student be seen and affirmed.
Wow, I love that. Well, thank you both so much. There is no better way to spend an afternoon than to spend it talking with Steve Fund Advisory experts. I want to thank you so much for this dynamic, insightful discussion. I think that we have so many takeaways. I see we have a comment. It's been an amazing conversation. Thank you. So many takeaways about, but I think the main takeaway is right here at the end, that no matter if it's 1 student, 20 students, or 100 students, making students feel seen is what is going to impact them the most. I also want to ask participants to please answer a few short questions about their experience. Please share your thoughts on this community conversation. We're putting a short survey in the chat. We have not had the response rate that we would love to have so far with the survey. So please do just take a minute to let us know, if you got something out of this conversation and what we can offer next to continue to support our students of color. And with that, I'm going to turn it right over to our Vice President for Programming, Brandy Pretlow.
Thank you, Dr. Ocampo, and thank you, Dr. Mason and Dr. Manesse. Just want to say thank you to everyone who's participated and joined us for today. We always will have more to come, so please join and visit our website for more information or questions to learn more about the Steve Fund, which is stevefund.org. Thanks and take care.